stranger.
Greetings, travellers, and welcome to episode 70 of the Innsmouth Book Club podcast. As you can see, we brought you to the Gillman Hotel because we're going to be joined in a few moments by a very esteemed guest. I'm one of your hosts, Tim Mendes.
And I'm the other one, Rob Hoyton. Yes, we're back at the Gillman Hotel. We've been here quite a lot lately. In fact, we've been here so much that Pubert, the receptionist, has given me these little cards to hand out. They're like loyalty cards. If everyone would like to take one of those, apparently you get priority booking and you get 20% off of breakfast.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Well, you say nice, but actually the breakfast is a plate of whelks.
Yeah.
Big, juicy whelks.
Big, juicy ones. Yeah, a provenance unknown.
Innsmouth whelks.
Innsmouth whelks.
Yeah. So I think we don't need to go any more into that. Shall we head on upstairs to room 428?
Indeed.
And here's our special guest today. It's Mr. Paul Fricker. Hey, Paul, how are you doing?
Hello. Yeah, very well. Thank you.
Thanks for coming in, sir. And is this your first visit to Innsmouth?
No, I came a few times with my parents when I was a child. They used to bring me on holiday here.
Oh, nice.
Leastways, it kind of feels like that. I'd never been on a family holiday until I was about 9. And a few days before we left, my parents told me we were going on holiday, and that totally blew my mind because I couldn't conceive of spending a night away from home. And then they took me to North Wales.
Oh, yeah.
And we went Llanfair Fechan. It's like this little seaside town. This kind of in the late 70s. Actually, it's not that late because I went to see Star Wars at Llandudno Cinema.
Ah, right.
That was, because it didn't come to my local town for like about a year. I guess it was just a small movie and nobody wanted to see it. I don't know what they were thinking.
I suppose it was, wasn't it, at the time? Yeah, when it first came out.
And fond memories of going there. Yeah. Nice. But I think the Gillman Hotel has changed hands a couple of times since then, maybe.
Yeah, it's been through a few renovations as well, but they still keep the damp running down the walls just for the ambience.
Yeah. Well, they just recently added a health spa, didn't they? Yeah. Inspired by Michael Shea's Fat Face.
Oh, yes, the Fat Face Health Spa. Yeah. Not a place to go dip in.
Unless you like shog-off poetry.
So, Paul, you're well known as a writer, game designer, author, but how did you first get into weird fiction and Lovecraft in general? Was it Lovecraft first and then weird fiction, or which way around?
Yeah, it was Lovecraft first. Yeah, definitely. So I think I first heard of Lovecraft and Call of Cthulhu. It's probably in the old Deities and Demigods that came out for D&D in about 82, 83, in that first edition, from which afterwards they were pulled. But I think I was at school with a friend of mine, and we would also buy White Dwarf, and there'd be Call of Cthulhu scenarios in that in the early days. And we were intrigued by this. I think neither of us had read any Lovecraft. And it wasn't until another seaside town I ended up living in was Plymouth in about 87.
Oh, right. Oh.
And my friend Phil and I played quite a lot of role-playing games. And he lent me his copy of The Haunter of the Dark, I think, and I went to bed that night and I read Pickman's Model. I was about 19 at the time. And I found it pretty scary, I have to say. Yeah. I was, sitting there late at night reading it in bed, and I found that pretty eerie and spooky. I didn't read a lot of horror stories back then, and that was what sort of started me. And then I went along to the local game store and picked up a copy of Call of Cthulhu and ran the Paper Chase, a sort of simple little scenario, a great one. It's in the starter box set now. Just with me as keeper and my mate Phil as single player. And I can remember we were talking about this. I visited Phil last weekend and we were just chatting about this. And we were saying we couldn't really conceive of how that would work. Playing, we we weren't going down a dungeon killing monsters,
yeah,
what would we do? How is this going to work? But we played it and somehow it worked. And here we are all these years later, still playing.
I think that's the thing. It was so very different to your D&D at that time, wasn't it? It was, it was just a completely different kind of thing. And I think that's why it appealed to a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, I think it did bridge the gap more back then, because if you look at some of those early scenarios from the early 80s, they are, some of them are a bit like, here's a house and here's some rooms with monsters in, and here's, kind of like treasure, here's a book you can get and things like that. They do feel a bit more D&D-ish than, and definitely it's developed over the years and become quite different to that now on the whole. Although, going around the cellar and killing monsters is always going to be great in my book. But
oh yeah, absolutely.
It's definitely become a thing of its own, which is very discreet and different to the kind of adventuring of Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah.
I suppose the biggest difference for me was with D&D, you're rewarded constantly for murdering these poor things that are just minding their own business. And
they're asking for trouble.
Yeah, just having all that treasure lying around, And in Call of Cthulhu, you kind of, I suppose we can talk about it. You're doing good in a sense. You're trying to protect the world, perhaps, from these things, and you just get punished for it. There's no reward at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the key difference between the two, though, is that in Dungeons and Dragons, it's a game of acquisition. So you are gaining power. You are literally going up levels of power as a character. Your stats are going up. Your strength is increasing. Your intelligence might be increasing. Those things go up as you go up levels. You gain treasure. And that's not just a abstract. That's magic items. That's wands. That's spells. So you're constantly accumulating stuff and becoming more powerful. Whereas in Call of Cthulhu, you start as a regular person and you might acquire a few special talents. You might get a spell or a few spells, but those things are helpful to a degree, but they have a twist in them, and they usually debilitate you to some degree as well because of the effect on your sanity. Yeah. And really in Call of Cthulhu, we're seeing that kind of a death spiral. We're seeing, and you've got to be someone who enjoys buying into that, as I think we enjoy reading weird fiction and Lovecraft and seeing what it does to these characters, how they want to perhaps do good or at the very least save themselves, but somehow things never turn out well for them. And I think we have to be able to invest in that and enjoy that kind of fiction. Yeah. And if you don't enjoy that, that's not for you. It's not for everyone. Not everyone enjoys that kind of fiction.
Yeah, there's rarely a happy ending, is there, really? I mean,
no.
I think there's a Dunwich Horror, I guess. They kind of get away at the end,
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's not many where someone isn't mad or missing or has got a thing over his head or something.
But even with the Dunwich Horror, you've had this horror revealed to you as they kind of cast the powder over it and you see the horror on the hill. And, the people who've gone through that, now they realize there's this eldritch power out there that they've managed to allay for a while, but is it going to come back?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Temporary
respite. Yeah. I think all these victories are just temporary, aren't they? And then we don't watch horror films for happy endings.
True.
Oh no. I think my all-time favorite Lovecraft meme is it's just a picture of Lovecraft on a blue background, and it just says, "And they all lived happily ever after." Just kidding. They're all dead or insane. It's one of those that just makes me laugh every time because it's so funny because it's true.
Yeah. It is.
But there is that sort of grim humour in it, and something we say a lot is we think that Lovecraft had a much bigger sense of humour than people give him credit for, and I feel this is almost like a gallows type of humour.
Yeah, I think so. It certainly comes out in role-playing games. I mean, most role-playing games, people there's some attempts sometimes to sort of say, to give them gravitas and say it's a serious pursuit and we're doing, serious gaming. In reality, it's like, you mentioned memes, Tim. It's like that meme where, this is what I think I do. This is what other people think I do. This is what I actually do. We think we're like being serious, storytellers, and that word storytelling sounds very serious. But really, we're sat around a table eating Doritos and laughing and telling stupid jokes most of the time.
Yeah.
But not always. Sometimes, that's not to demean the hobby. There is some great stuff, and I'm sure we've all had great experiences and told some really good stories along the way.
And I think I found the other thing with Call of Cthulhu as well. I've just got back into playing it actually at the Bedford club. And we had a scenario where you expect to face some sort of big, horrible thing at the end. Generally, that's how a lot of them are set up. But in this one, the whole party was virtually disabled and almost killed by some young kids with knives.
That's reality creeping in, isn't
it? That's great.
It was an Arkham story, yeah. And
right.
I won't say the details of the scenario, but basically we got stabbed up by some kids down to 2 hit points and all that kind of thing. I thought this is so different from heroic fantasy fiction, And
actually, that brings to mind one or two films that I found. Like Eden Lake.
Oh, Eden! I loved Eden Lake, but it's so grim. Yeah,
I mean, it's not kids, but I think it's kind of like adolescents, isn't it? Or maybe older teenagers. I found that super grim.
It's actually terrifying.
Yeah,
because I do a lot of walking, so I end up in these isolated little villages and stuff.
Yeah,
and you see groups of kids like that in the woods, and the first thing my brain does, right, because it's wired for horror, is oh no, if they've got like a dog called Bonnie, I'm screwed.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Yeah, that was bad.
So how did you go from playing games into writing games or scenarios? Was that like the homebrew thing that a lot of people do? Just start writing your own scenarios at first?
Yeah, I think role-playing is, as a general thing, I think it really encourages people to be creative in terms of writing, just for themselves. They're just writing scenarios for themselves. At its most base level, you sit down to play a game you've never played before. Somebody gives you a character sheet and you've got to pretend. You've got to make up dialogue. You've got to make up what you look like. You've got to, so it just engages your imagination. I think that's like the key thing of role-playing games, is to inspire people's imagination. And I was looking through some paperwork. We moved house. Well, we've been here about 9 years now, but some years ago, I went through a box of stuff that I'd had like sat on the side for ages, thinking I'll go through this stuff at some point. And it's been like in this box for years. And there was this brown envelope, and I opened it up, and it was like an old White Dwarf envelope that copies of White Dwarf used to come through the post in. And I pulled out, and it was this scenario that I'd written when I was back at school to submit to White Dwarf, I guess. I think maybe I did submit it and, got it back.
Oh, nice.
And I'd, on an actual typewriter with my own little rudimentary drawings and stuff like that. So I guess even back then I was trying to, write scenarios and get them published, but I'd kind of forgotten about this. So it wasn't until about 2000 when I met up with Mike Mason. He lived kind of reasonably local to me, and I was looking for people who were into Call of Cthulhu, and he was publishing a fanzine called The Whisperer at the time. And we met up at the pub just up the road from where I am right now, and we chatted. And one of the things that he did at that time was he ran a group called the Cult of Keepers, which was a small group of GMs that run Call of Cthulhu at UK conventions. And I wanted to be a part of that. So I started going to conventions and I started writing scenarios for the group. And one of the deals that we had, that Mike had with that group, was that you wouldn't just write your own scenario and run it. No, you'd write a scenario and submit it to him, and he would select the scenarios that were going to be run by the group at a convention. So it might be, Battle Masters or something in Leicester, and there was, say, 6 or 7 of us running the games. And I really felt like I need to make my scenario as good as I can so that Mike says we can run it at Battle Masters. And I would run, and if that was given the okay, given the green light, the GM who wrote the scenario would get to run it themselves, but it was also given to one of the other GMs. And the deal was that you would run your own, and you would run someone else's scenario.
Nice.
And this was really useful in 2 ways. One, because it pushed me to write, and 2, because you had to write it for someone else. It wasn't enough that you were writing it so that you could understand it. I mean, there's several levels of writing scenarios. One is that you just write it for yourself, and depending on who you are, that may be a few notes on the back of a cigarette box.
Sure.
It could just be as simple as that.
Yeah.
Yeah, some people delight in running with the minimum of preparation. Other people write reams, details.
Yeah.
But the second step is presenting it such that someone else can take it and read it and understand it. And if it's a friend, they can come back to you and say, "Hey, Paul, I don't really get what's happening in on this page," and that's fine because you can talk to them. And leaping on a bit, like the third stage is writing for publication, because they can't then come back to you and ask. Well, they can on the internet, but then they're going to say, "Well, you don't
what do they want to buy that for if they can't understand?"
Yeah, exactly. So it needs to be. It sort of goes through those 3 levels in my head. So that was kind of the grounding of writing for someone else. And then through that process, at one particular convention, there was one of the staff from Chaosium was at the convention. They played in the scenario that I'd written and asked me to submit it for publication. So that was the first thing that I'd had sort of properly published. And that was an eye-opener for me, because I realized that how much more work that third stage was, how much more work it was to try and dot all the I's and cross all the T's and answer the potential questions and put it in a structure which would make sense to someone who had never met me and never played the scenario and couldn't refer directly to me. So that was a scenario I published called Gatsby and the Great Race. Or Chaosium published back in about 2005. And then subsequent to that, I was working on, this was a time of a lot of development of indie RPGs.
Right.
And that was kind of the early days of that movement, I suppose, in the early 2000s. I mean, one can argue about what an indie RPG is and when that all began. But it was certainly a boom time, My Life with Master and various other games of that ilk, which are now like escaping my memory. What's it called? Dogs in the Vineyard, and games like this, like the really sort of, well, I was going to say big indie games, but the sort of the keystones of the sort of indie movement, as I saw it at the time, were coming out.
Yeah.
And so everybody was sort of there was also like the podcasting movement then of Sons of Kryos and people like that were putting out podcasts and talking about this whole thing. And I was very inspired by it and working on my own rules. And I think I shared these with Mike. And the upshot of that was that we presented those to Chaosium and said, how about me and Mike write 7th edition Call of Cthulhu? And we were given the green light for that.
Wow.
Leastways, okay, guys, you go away, write a draft, submit it, and we'll take it from there. And that's kind of how it rolled on. And that took a few years, and ultimately got published, I think 2015, something like that. Right.
Yeah. And that's still sort of latest edition, isn't it? As far as I know,
it is.
That's certainly what Stephanie's using. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's what most people will understand as Call of Cthulhu now, I think. I mean, there have been a number of iterations or editions over the years. Up until 7th edition, there was minimal change. And then sort of step from the previous editions to 7th edition is probably the biggest revision and sort of rewrite of the rules that it's taken in the 40 odd years of it being in print. And there's no great rush to bring out a new edition. I think much like, I see a big parallel here with 5th ed D&D.
Yeah.
They are talking about a new edition in inverted commas, but is that a new edition or is that just a refinement? It's not really clear, but that edition has also stood up probably longer than any other edition of D&D. I think that came out around 2015 as well. And when you look at the history of D&D, most editions only last, I think a bit less than that on average.
Yeah, it's a few years, isn't it, really? You think from basic D&D to AD&D to Dungeon Master's Guide and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It felt like it was developing quite quickly. So what did you change? Coming back into it, I've not noticed a lot of changes, but then I'm a player rather than a keeper. I guess the keeper will be more aware of changes. But the important thing is it feels like the same game.
Well, that's good to hear, because that was always a key criteria for Mike and myself. We wanted it to feel the same. So I kind of have this analogy of an old sports car that wasn't running as well as it could.
Right.
And, you had that car decades ago and you loved driving it. And Mike and I have opened up the bonnet and fiddled about with the engine. I don't know anything about cars. But we fiddled about with the engine and polished up the bodywork. So your experience of driving it now is you enjoy driving it and it brings to mind how you used to be when you used to drive it, but it runs smooth. And that's if that analogy stands up. So what we've introduced, the key changes, I suppose, 2 key changes that we introduced. One was pushing rolls. Yeah. So when you made a skill roll previously, you'd make the skill roll and then it's like, well, that failed. What do I do now? Can I do it again? That didn't really seem... if you just keep trying, well, what's the point in rolling? Do you just keep trying until you succeed? So we introduced this concept of pushing the roll, which meant that there had to be a downside to failing. So downside of failing, if you're offered a push, there's always like the question, well, what are you doing to push the roll?
Yeah.
And it usually means taking some sort of risk, taking more time when bad things could happen, taking some sort of risk that could potentially cause you harm in some way. And it may not be directly linked to what you're doing, but there's going to be some kind of negative consequence if you fail a pushed roll. And the effect that I enjoyed seeing in my players when we were playtesting this was, I would say, okay, well, you haven't managed to, they're trying to track this character through the woods, I remember, and they fail the tracking roll. And they're like, well, can we push it? And I'm like, well, what do you do? And they're, well, we get down on our hands and knees and we spend a while looking at the ground. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you can push the roll. And then they're like, oh, well, what might happen if we fail it? I'm like, well, and now I'm just, making something up. I'm like, well, you're going to be looking down on your hands and knees looking, maybe the thing you're looking for is up in the tree and it's going to jump on you, who knows? And they're like, we're not going to do that. So they didn't push the roll because it built the fear.
Yeah.
If it was the Arkham Horror living card game, it'd be whippoorwills coming out of the tree, wouldn't it? Yeah,
it would.
It's always them damn whippoorwills. They get me every time.
You gotta love a whippoorwill.
I do find exactly that, because it is, as a player, it then forces you. It can get a bit like, I roll a dice, I spot hidden, I roll a dice, I roll a dice. Whereas that is forcing you to actually role play through the event or what you're trying to do. It gives a bit more input to the player, I think, in that sense. Yeah,
I think that, the idea is that it builds a bit of apprehension because something bad can happen now. It's giving the GM license if you choose to push the roll, you're saying to the GM, I want to try this thing again. But I know if I fail this, if I roll under this number, above this number, get it right. If I fail the roll, I'm giving you license to do something bad to my character.
Nice.
Yeah.
You're going to push the horror back at me. I push the roll, you push the horror.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the deal. The other big thing I suppose we introduced was the idea of spending luck points.
Right. Yeah.
So previously, your luck was just that. It was just a fixed stat. And sometimes the keeper would call for a luck roll to determine, maybe the lights have gone out. Do I have a torch?
Yeah.
Well, give me a luck roll, something like that. But now you've got luck is a resource, so you can spend it. So if you miss that skill roll by 5 points, you can spend 5 luck. But that does mean, when you're stuck in the dark, have I got a torch? Well, suddenly that's 5% less likely.
Yes. You got to try and choose the best moment without knowing what's coming, But again, that gives the player, it feels like you get a little more agency because, you can be up against it constantly all the time. And I feel it just gives you that little bit of, dare I say the H word, hope.
Well, I think hope is an important thing in horror, isn't it? I mean, if the characters, in that horror film or horror story have no hope, or maybe they have no hope at the end, but they've got to have hope along the way. An epitome of loss of hope to me is the film The Mist. Have you seen The Mist?
Oh yes.
Oh yeah.
We won't say what happens at the end, but
but
the main character abandons hope, right?
That's grim, isn't it? That's
super grim. But up until that point, he's got hope.
Yeah.
I always see the hope in horror movies and horror stories in general, and video games, books, whatever. It's almost like Quicksilver or Fool's Gold, isn't it? It's this sort of ephemeral hope that's there just to keep the characters sort of trying, and then you just snatch it away at the last minute.
And I guess that's the epitome of Lovecraft, really. He's sort of showing us that there is no hope. We exist, then we cease to exist, and that's it. And we're not important. Yeah. And
best example, as always with this kind of thing, when you talk about hopelessness, is Thomas Ligotti, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, that is a hopeless universe that he's created, like completely. Yeah. And
yeah.
Well, I think he largely lives in it, doesn't it? Due to his I would say mental condition is the right word. I can't remember the exact term for it now, but basically he has a lot of trouble experiencing what we'd call happiness.
Yes.
Does he?
Apparently.
Right. Yeah,
it's an actual condition.
Yeah, I forget the name of the term, but it means you don't feel joy, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's very sad. I mean, I don't think that one has to be of that mindset well, I don't know. Maybe you do. I was going to say you don't have to be of that mindset to write like that, but
no,
I don't know. I'm no expert.
But this is the interesting thing as well, because typically with any entertainment, Hollywood, whatever it is, the good always triumphs over evil. The ring gets thrown into Mount Doom or whatever it is. But with this, as we've said, you've got that element of hopelessness in it, and yet it seems to continue to spread and grow now more than ever. Lovecraft games, videos, films, cuddly toys.
Yeah, I wonder about the relationship between the relatively safe world we live in. I think we live in a very safe time, compared to historical times and other places. Our situation is pretty safe. I can walk out in my town, at night, wherever, and feel pretty safe. And we can indulge ourselves in terrible horror. But I wonder if we were in other times, if we were living just after a terrible war or something like that, whether we would want a different form of entertainment. I don't know. I'm not. It's just kind of something some people have said to me. Yeah, makes me think that.
I've often wondered about that myself, because I've always seen the desire to get scared. It's almost like a primal thing, isn't it? I almost see it as like a callback to when we were living wild and being chased by saber-toothed cats and things like that. It's that fight or flight instinct that's sort of hardwired into our DNA.
And I don't know about you, but I don't experience that in real life.
No, exactly.
And I'm glad I don't. I don't want
same.
to. I have experienced it, but I have experienced it, but probably just a handful of times, to be honest.
Yeah.
And it's never been like somebody is going to kill me.
Yes. Yeah.
I've never had to face that. And I've never had to face, like, we've all had unfortunate things happen in our lives, but the grimness of it, I think we have the privilege to be able to indulge ourselves in the grimness of the fiction.
Yeah.
And that's
without facing the reality of it.
It's living vicariously through these characters, isn't it? It's experiencing that sort of adrenaline rush of fight or flight without actually being in any kind of danger.
It's a bit like going to a theme park and going on the rides where they throw you around and hopefully you're going to be fine. I always have faith in them that I'm going to be. I've never come across it yet, but that's part of the thrill, isn't it?
I'd rather watch a scary film than go on one of those. But then the other side of it is, even if you go back to the year dot, the saber-tooth tiger thing, we've always sat around a fire telling scary stories, right? About what's outside that little circle of light,
Yeah.
And our imagination, if we're in the dark or, with low lights, it's very easy to imagine, ghosts and demons and spirits and culture is, most cultures have a mythology of that stuff. People somehow are or seem to be hardwired to imagine pretty terrible stuff.
I drive my partner mad when we go out walking and we're in the woods and it's getting dark, because my brain just kicks into story mode and I start going on about ghouls in the undergrowth and all this kind of stuff. Like, will you stop it?
My daughter, used to, I don't know. We just had this story about a monster that lives under the stairs. Nice. I just used to talk about the monster under the stairs. And then, you have to console her that, okay, there is no monster under the stairs.
But then you go, or is there?
No, because you wanted to go to sleep. Eventually. She's 25 now. She's over it.
Oh, right. So she's over it. Yeah. I mean, this is something we talk about a lot. And I know you've spoken about it on your podcast as well, which we'll come to in a minute, of course. This idea, especially as a scenario writer or as a story writer or whatever it is, how do you balance that idea of entertainment and real world horror? So are there things in scenarios that you wouldn't perhaps use that subject, or does it depend on the group, that kind of thing?
I think it depends on the group. And again, this depends whether it's for publication or for personal use. Yeah, there are certainly things that I wouldn't put into a scenario for publication. But it kind of occurs to me that films seem to put these things in.
Yeah.
But I guess that films and role-playing games are two different things. And films, you're a passive viewer. Whereas with a role-playing game, you're an active participant, and we have to respect that. We have to be very sensitive and mindful when it comes to themes of sexual abuse or certain types of violence.
Yeah.
And, those just aren't appropriate in a published scenario. If you want to explore those things with people that and in role-playing games, there are various, more recent years, there's been the adoption of safety tools like the X card and so on. So, I think with your own group, with people that, want to explore whatever dark themes you're all on board with the use of those kind of tools and everybody's consent, then you can kind of explore whatever you want to explore. But so in short, there are things that I wouldn't include, but you might allude to.
Sometimes alluding to it can be just as effective or more effective than actually displaying it.
Yeah,
I guess.
People's imagination. Again, it like comes back to triggering people's imagination, really firing up people's imagination, and they often, if you just hint at something, they fill in the blanks with the worst thing they can think of. The scariest monster they can think of.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, but it goes back to the classic, not showing the monster. The classic, like in old 60s Doctor Who, you didn't see the monster till like the third or fourth episode.
Yeah.
Right. And that'd get your mind going. It's like Alien is a great example. And I think a lot of modern film is really shooting itself in the foot, but you see it all straight away. And it's the law of diminishing returns, right? There's only so many times you can see this big tentacled abomination before it's kind of like, okay, you start seeing the seams and where the man's zipped up in the costume, that kind of thing. I think they could do more with showing less.
I think so. I mean, I was rewatching Beasts recently, the 70s sort of horror shows that were on ITV.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
And I think the second episode, I can't remember what it's called, but it's about a rat invasion. And it's this couple living in a house, and they hear a report on the radio that there are these hordes of rats running in front of cars, and people reporting them. And they can hear them under the floorboards. And the show is, I think it's about 50 minutes. They're quite long. They're not like half-hour shows, which I thought they were in my memory, but they're about 50 minutes long. You don't see a single rat, but you hear them, and you see the couple looking out the window at people being attacked by the rats and the horror on their faces. And through the whole episode, you don't even no rats. You don't see a single rat, but it's pretty terrifying.
I think now sometimes we watch the trailer to a film and think, well, we don't need to watch the film now because.
For sure.
It's just a 2-minute trailer and you've got it all,
That's true. Yeah.
In that sense, though, do you find one thing I noticed, and I listen to things like the Appendix N podcast, Jeff and Hoy, that they talk about the development of RPGs as well. And it seems to be a much more diverse scene now. The games are more diverse. The people coming in are more diverse. You can play pretty much anything you can imagine, and it seems to be largely a shift away from the murdering D&D sort of crew again, which can be fun to play at times.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's that word you said, diverse. So that is still part of the hobby. Killing monsters and taking their stuff. That kind of classic game is still part of the hobby, but so are a multitude of other games. And I think the gaming hobby is, I hope it is, and I think it is a very welcoming hobby to a great diversity of people. Everybody's welcome, everybody can participate. And the range of games, it's hard to imagine a game that doesn't exist, because it's just everything can be a role-playing game, things beyond your imagination. So, and that to some degree, that's been the case for a very long time, even from the 70s. When you look back at the 70s, even in those early days, there were loads of different role-playing games coming out.
Was it like Bunnies and Burrows or something? Was that another? I remember Tunnels and Trolls, and I'm sure it was Bunnies and Burrows.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, there's books, there's more and more books being written about this, and there's lots of games then, and there's just, if you look at the release schedule of role-playing games now, and I'm not talking about from the big publishers, but from everybody, it's just more than anybody could possibly keep up with, coming out weekly. So it's great. It seems to be a boom time for RPGs. I think, I don't know what that's down to. I think it's partly down to the proliferation of actual plays and people seeing it online, and it's kind of coming into popular culture through shows like Stranger Things, and all that. It's just a lot more people are becoming aware of it, which is great.
Yeah, I was amazed when I was at a convention over Easter. There was a guy there. He runs like a game store. That must have been fairly local or something, because the first day he turned up with all these RPGs, all these things that, like, I don't even know what half of them were. And I was just like, for everything from your sort of like anime inspired all the way through to like military sci-fi and all the rest of it. And it just all got snapped up. So he went back to his shop the second day and come back with a whole bunch more of different stuff. And I was like, how many RPGs are there?
Oh, man. Yeah. There's no end.
Yeah. So how do you approach writing a scenario? I mean, Tim and I both write stories, and it strikes me there's a lot of similarities between the two. I mean, that series of stages you mentioned earlier is pretty much what you go through. Yeah. Because the difficulty with writing the story is you know the background and you know everything that's going to happen and what the character's motivations are, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the reader will. So,
this is why you have a beta reader, isn't it? And then the third stage is basically it's the editing stage, isn't it? It's when you send it off to the editor and they go for the developmental edits. It's I thought it struck me when you were saying that, so I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I guess one of the differences here in what you're saying is you said the reader doesn't necessarily know what's going on, but I mean, the reader doesn't necessarily have to know, do they?
Oh, no, there is that as well.
Yeah.
But they've got to know enough to understand the story. I mean, generally speaking, unless you're, I think, a very, very good writer.
Yes.
Some people can get away with that sort of head spin sort of stuff, like what's going on.
Or you're writing Bizarro, which a lot of it is kind of stream of consciousness.
Yeah. But I guess there can be gaps in the story where I think, well, I know this character, but I don't know what their background is, or I know this. Yeah. So,
sure.
But yeah, that's interesting that those things parallel with writing stories. When I approach writing a scenario, I guess, it is a bit like writing a story in that you can start in all sorts of different places. I don't know where you guys start with your stories. Do you start from just a random idea that occurs to you, or do you fall in love with a town and think, oh, I'll write about this town, or you hear a newspaper report and you think, well, that inspires me? How do you guys start with a story?
All of the above, pretty much, depending on the story.
Whatever, yeah,
depending on the story.
Yeah, you might hear a bit of folklore and you think, oh, what if that was a werewolf, or anything like that can.
So that's just the same, isn't it? Yeah. That's just the same as writing a scenario. And one of the things about being in that group with the Cult of Keepers and working with, sometimes we would try and let's collaborate on a scenario, and somebody would just start off and they would sort of start off talking about how they would, the seeds for the scenario, for this scenario we're just going to write. And I'd think, oh, well, I'm clearly not doing it right because I never do this. They're talking about, well, let's decide where it's going to be based and what we're going to research. And I'm like, oh, I didn't know people did this. So it became very clear to me, different people approach things very differently. And I'm sure it's the same with whatever you're writing, whether it's a story or a scenario. Because for a scenario, you're not coming up with a finished story, but you're coming up with a lot of elements of a story that people can. It's a bit like coming up with a recipe, I guess. You're coming up with the ingredients and giving some guide as to how they're going to be combined, but then you're not giving them the whole recipe, I guess. You want people to make different things out of this recipe.
Yeah, it's like you're giving them the ingredients list, but without the directions, pretty much.
Yeah, or just like the first direction.
Yeah,
or like there's the directions, but bits have been crossed out. So somebody might come up with a cake, somebody might make it into it might end up sweet or savory, depending on what you add. Yeah.
As a chef, I totally understand that analogy.
You're a chef.
I was for over 25 years, something like that. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. But what you were saying about the different, how that person you were talking about approached it differently, it's the same conversation I have with writers who are plotters.
Right.
I'm what they call, I'm a pantser. I have ideas and I just write. I fly by the seat of my pants. But a friend of mine is a meticulous plotter, and he has spreadsheets and post-it notes and like cork boards with bits of string connecting things and all this kind of business, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just there. I'm just sort of there going, what? Just randomly typing.
I tried to do that. I got a load of post-it notes because I thought that's the thing to do. And that white board over there behind me, I had them plastered with bits of post-it notes with all little things on it. And then I just left them there and carried on writing. I never looked at them. I don't know what they're there for.
The time I tried to plot, I didn't get anything done because I was too busy mucking about with Excel trying to make a spreadsheet, but I should have been writing.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm researching something at the moment. I'm doing a book set in sort of Roman Britain.
All right.
And I thought if you're doing something historical, you've got to be reasonably accurate.
Mm.
And I've ended up with a shopping bag full of books that I'm gradually working through. And I could have had 3 days writing, and how accurate do you have to be really? Did you find that with like the 1920s setting, there's quite a lot of information in there about the 20s. Do you get people pull you up on that?
I don't. Yes, occasionally you get people pull you up on something when you're running a game. I've had it not very often, but occasionally I have had somebody, for example, I was running a game and there's a rich person and they're having a garden party, and one of the and he's talking about money and trying to talk about investments with one of the player characters. And one of the players said to me, this isn't really right, because he wouldn't be talking about this stuff because it wouldn't be socially acceptable.
Right.
And that hadn't really occurred to me, but I was like, well, he is talking about it. Because it seemed to me like this could be out of character for him, and that's fine.
Yeah.
And I take note of what the player said, because that was out of character, and it's kind of like, oh, good, that could be a problem, but yeah, I'm glad the person highlighted it. But in that instance, it felt justified.
Yeah,
I think, like you said, if you're writing in whatever period, whether it be Roman time or the 1920s or whatever, you need to be convincing, I suppose. But that doesn't need to be. I don't think you need to show off your knowledge.
Yeah.
Because now when I read some of the scenarios that people have written some years ago and I read them, at the time I was very impressed by their knowledge of, I don't know, whatever it is, World War II tanks or something like that. Wow, this is amazing. They know a lot about this stuff, don't they? And now, having gone through that process, I think, wow, they paid a lot of attention to Wikipedia, didn't they? It could just be as simple as that, because if you just put that stuff down, it looks like you know all about it.
Interesting you say that, because when I was starting out, it was in like my first year of being published. I wrote a story that was set during the Second World War, and I had somebody in a Messerschmitt.
Right.
And me being me, I was like, right, I'm going to need to Wikipedia this. So I'll put all these specifications of the engine, what are the fiberglass, and all this kind of crap, right? And the editor just got the pencil out and went a big X through all that. He was like, we don't need any of that. He's in a plane. We know what a plane looks like. It's like, all right, fair enough.
Yeah, because it is just like showing off, And Lovecraft does this sometimes with stuff that has been subsequently sort of found that, he's just quoting the Encyclopedia Britannica, which he had a set.
Yes.
Was it Encyclopedia Britannica? I think it was. And he was just quoting chunks of that, because people have kind of gone back and looked at that and said that would have been in the edition that he had, But I think a little bit of that. So if you're in the Messerschmitt and you can sort of make some reference to something that makes it feel more like you're there.
That's how I did it in the end. I was just like, a couple of bits, but we didn't need to know about the fuel injection. We didn't need to know about how the propeller moves. Everybody knows how a propeller works. All this kind of stuff.
Well, you say that.
Well, yeah, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So yeah, I put the sort of like the basic things, just a little bit of flavor, and I did just because the first thing I did, because I was quite green at this point, right? It was in a big old info dump right at the beginning of the story, and they were just like, just put a bit there and a bit there and a bit there, and that's where working with a good editor like helps, because they're going, look, that's just overload, man.
Yeah. No, I think that stands up for scenarios. I think, that whole thing of just giving a few little seeds of, when you just, or even just running a game, like you be the same as writing a story, I guess, presenting a scene. It's like you just want to sort of say they're going into a room, and you just want to give a few little bits of the room, and your mind fills in the rest. If there's an antique desk with a leather top, suddenly you're getting the impression of a plush study with a nice old desk, and you sort of picture, there's probably wallpaper and there's probably nice curtains and everything. You haven't been told that, but that all just comes along with it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So a few little, what would you call them? Sort of, I don't know, keystones or something that trigger people's imagination to create that image in their head. And not everybody needs to have exactly the same image as well. We've talked about this before, that when you say you're going into, I don't know, a cheese shop, but everybody suddenly knows what the cheese shop is, but everybody's picturing a bit different shop.
Right. I've got a Monty Python cheese.
Well, yeah. But it doesn't matter that everybody pictures it a bit differently.
Yeah, because it's in their mind that it's happening, and that's the important thing. Yeah. And that's why it's so easy, like we've said before, if you use a setting like Victorian London, all you've got to say is fog. Land.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah, fog and cobbles, isn't it? It's pretty much all you need.
Yeah. I mean, I'm right there now. That's
exactly.
That's
Yeah.
I mean, it relies somewhat on cliches.
Yeah.
And stereotypes, but then you can play against those as well. But you can use those just to transport the person immediately. It's a bit like an opening scene in a film, isn't it? You just see that's what you'd see. You'd see the fog rolling on the cobblestones and a townhouse, and somebody with a walking stick going up to it in a top hat, and that's your opening scene. And we know where we are. We don't need to be told anything else.
That's it. It sets the tone, doesn't it? Which again is what Lovecraftian stuff is all about. Largely, is the tone and the atmosphere, as much as anything else.
And he's often creating an unusual atmosphere, isn't he? It's kind of an eerie place that we're not really familiar with, I think.
They always strike me as places like, whether it's Kingsport or Innsmouth or something. These towns are you're in a town, but it's not quite like a town you've ever been in before. Yeah. There's always that element of age and decay and something just a little bit off.
And you're kind of seeing behind the curtain. You're seeing bits you don't really want to see.
Yes, put that curtain back.
Yeah.
It's one of my favourite things. I seem to say it a hell of a lot, but it's right. It's the uncanny valley, isn't it? It's something you can recognise, but slightly off.
Yeah, when you start looking at it, you go, "Oh, wait a minute."
Yeah. It's like, hang on a minute, that's deeply unsettling when you start to actually scrutinise.
Yeah.
And what I found with the original stories as well was some years ago when I was driving around a lot, I was listening to the HP Podcraft guys.
They're great.
And how much when they went over the stories and explained things, it increased the horror, because then you start thinking, oh, I've never noticed that. And then, that implication, I never really picked that up the first time. So they sort of creep back up on you again, these stories, I think.
They were very good on picking up on things that I'd missed. Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm loving what we're doing at the minute, Rob, with the Strange Shadows, because I'm getting that with the Clark Ashton Smith.
Yeah.
Because things I'll pick up on, you haven't, and things you pick up on, I haven't. So it's like I'm seeing all these stories, even though some of them I've read like quite a few times, I'm seeing them with almost fresh eyes. And it enhances rather than detracts from them. And I think that's the strength of this kind of literature. You can sort of pick into it without it losing its allure, so to speak.
Yeah, that kind of close reading that you don't normally do if you're just reading it as you would most stories, I guess.
And with things being left unexplained, there's room for speculation, which is always an interesting sort of conversation you can have there.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is something you do on the good friends of Jackson Elias very well.
Well, thank you.
So
we try.
How did that? 3 questions really. How did that start? Where did the name come from? Because everyone wants to know who Jackson Elias is. And as podcast people ourselves, I'm interested in your setup and your tech and how that has evolved over the years as well.
Okay.
Because if it's anything like us, you go from like talking in a tin can.
Yeah.
Where did it start? So the Good Friends of Jackson Elias podcast started. We just been going for just over 10 years now.
Oh.
10 years last month. It began in early 2013. 7th edition was just sort of, well, in the process of being, I think, kickstarted and published. It was all kind of around that stage. And myself and Matt and Scott had all worked on 7th edition. So I'd worked on the rulebook. Matt had written Amidst the Ancient Trees, which is one of the scenarios in the core rulebook. Scott did some editing work on the core rulebook and wrote the scenario for the Keeper screen, Blackwater Creek. And so I kind of saw these 2 guys, and we all lived locally. And I thought, we could do a podcast, because there wasn't as many podcasts then. Yeah. I can say with authority, because there are millions of them now. And there was us, and there was the Miskatonic University podcast. But in retrospect, they hadn't been going that long, but they were pretty well established at the time. But I felt like we could take a different angle on things, or even if we take a similar angle, we're 3 British guys, whereas that's an American podcast, and there's plenty of room for people to take a different approach to the same subject matter, I think. So that's kind of where it began. And the name, so the name comes from the campaign Masks of Nyarlathotep. And in the previous edition, the kind of kicker to it was you receive a letter from your good friend Jackson Elias. Nice. And it was just this phrase, your good friend, Jackson Elias, which always kind of tickled me. I think the other guys were like, what? We can't call it that. Nobody's going to know what this is. I was like, yeah, we can do that. And I think because we were working with Chaosium, and we'd going to say, I think we'd all got stuff published at that point. I guess we weren't complete unknowns, so we'd got some people who would be interested in listening, and then it just kind of grew from there. I did subsequently at times regret that choice, because when I look at the Miskatonic University podcast, it's got the word Miskatonic in it.
That's right? A nice one, isn't it? That is a nice one.
Anybody interested in Call of Cthulhu or Lovecraft or anything of that ilk, they're going to see that name and they're going to latch onto it. Whereas with ours, unless you knew that campaign, that isn't going to mean anything to you. I don't know how much that matters in retrospect, because through the power of social media, and that's how we tend to promote things nowadays. I don't know how much the name actually matters.
It's like a band name, right? We're going to call our band the Beatles. It's a shit name, isn't it?
Yeah. And that's kind of what I figured, because I used to. I mentioned it earlier. Back in the early 2000s, I used to listen to a show called Sons of Kryos. Well, what is that? But it was a role-playing game show. It had a meaning of its own, but to me, it just a name, right? Yeah. Just a name. There was another question, though. I've answered the first 2. I think it was the third one. Oh, tech. People are gonna love this. Okay, so after, I don't know, we'd been going what seemed like a long time. I think it was probably about 6 months. And we heard about Patreon. So I was like, well, let's start a Patreon, because, other shows are doing it, I think we could raise a bit of money to help us with the show and everything. Because certainly when we started it, there was no conception of that. And we took the money. Well, actually, I think I forwarded some money, on the basis that we'd got a steady income coming in with it. And Scott and I went to a music shop in Northampton and invested in some quality microphones. So we've got Neumann 105 microphones.
Right.
I don't know why I'm looking around at the microphone because I can't read the thing. It's got a little symbol on it, this little symbol. But it's a Neumann 105, and they're very good. What is it? There's two types of microphone. What are they?
Oh, yeah, condenser.
Yep,
Condenser,
it's a condenser microphone.
And directional.
Right.
Yeah. What's this? Yeah. Anyway, so it's a condenser mic, so it does pick up the room. It's not the other kind is you have to be quite close up to it for it to work. But I'm told that condenser microphones produce a better sound. It seems to produce a good sound. And we've got Scarlett interface. So this plugs into a Scarlett interface, which then plugs into the iMac that I'm on, which is the same iMac that we started recording on 10 years ago. So,
oh, wow.
Nice.
You couldn't do that. You couldn't do that with Windows, could you?
I don't think so. So that's kind of the setup. I don't know if you got any more questions about that, but that's
it. Just interests, and we both do this. You listen to a lot of other podcasts. Some I listen to regularly, and other ones you listen just to see what they sound like.
Yeah,
and it does vary quite a lot, I have to say.
I think it's generally better than it used to be, because you used to get some very ropey recordings. I mean,
oh, absolutely.
I kind of think either you're ropey and difficult to listen to, or you're okay. And if you're okay, you're okay.
Yeah.
I think it's beyond that, beyond the level of okay. The only people that care are other podcasters.
That's probably a good point. Yeah.
I mean, I do remember having somebody come up to me at a games convention and say, "Oh, they listen to the podcast." This is probably about 6 or 7 years ago, certainly before COVID, and saying yours is the only one we can listen to in the car. Because when you're listening to audio in the car, and I've certainly done this with some podcasts, because of the noise of the car, you've got to have it turned up loud. Yeah. And then if there's a harshness to the recording, or if it's not clear, that distortion gets louder and it just becomes harder on your ears to listen to. Whereas if you've got a quality, if the sound is good, then you can turn it up loud and it still sounds okay.
Yeah.
So I think that is to some degree a measure of it. For most people walking around with, earbud headphones in their ears, I guess it doesn't really matter too much, but as long as it, sounds okay.
Yeah. Yeah, you say that, but I listened to he was a Doctor Who podcast a few years ago. I put it on my headphones when I went shopping, and it was like somebody sticking shards of ice in my ears.
Really?
It was that really sort of tinniness.
Yeah.
And it was like, I can't listen to it. So I had to wait till I got home and put it on my actual speaker so I could turn the bass up and turn the treble down.
Oh, right. So you could put it out with the EQ. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I find nowadays most things I listen to seem, it's very rare that I hear one now that sounds like so bad I don't want to listen to it, I guess.
Yeah. I think the tech now, over things like Zoom or other platforms are available, they've really got their act together. And I think if you think back to the days of Skype and that sort of stuff, it's just progressed so much now.
Yeah.
And I suppose in a way, lockdown or the pandemic was instrumental in that to a large extent. That sort of stuff had to develop.
Yeah, that certainly changed. It changed things a lot for us, because up until the pandemic, the three of us would meet in this room where I am now and record, and we'd have the three mics set up. So we'd each got a mic, but we were each being picked up by the other mics. So we'd just record onto one feed and I'd edit it. Then with the pandemic, we were recording remotely, and that gave us 3 discrete tracks, which could then be, mixed much more easily, because you're not each one isn't picking up the other. So Scott's taken over the editing now, and I think is able to produce probably an improved sound because, it's kind of easier because you've got the 3 discrete feeds, and we each record our own feed individually and then, combine them afterwards.
Yeah.
And just in case there's anyone out there who hasn't listened to the Good Friends of Jackson Lion podcast, what's the idea behind it?
So the initial idea was to talk about Call of Cthulhu. But after 10 years, it's like, we still talk about Call of Cthulhu. But we, to keep the show going, I've always wanted just to talk about things that interest me, or interest us, the 3 of us. And that extends to books, stories, films. What else have we done? Related media and horror. So anything, as we say at the top of the show, it's about Call of Cthulhu, it's about horror films and horror gaming in general.
Yeah.
So I think we started looking at films, and we do several films in a show, but now we kind of do a deep dive into a film. We give a synopsis, and then we try to pull out bits as we're doing that to sort of say, well, if this were in a game, we'd do it like this, or this inspires me for a game idea or a story idea. And we do have some listeners that don't game, or that have started gaming because they listened, but certainly some listeners who don't play games. And that kind of surprises me. I'm very happy that they listen, but it does surprise me a little, because I kind of think our listenership is all going to be gamers, but you never quite know that. You can never be sure of that.
But I can kind of see that, and I can kind of get that, because then you do things like you did your recent one on Victorian spiritualism or a particular person. And while you apply a lot of it, or you talk about it in a gaming context, you're not sort of, you're not really talking about the nuts and bolts just of gaming as such.
Yeah.
You're putting that subject in a gaming context, but there's a lot of information in there that doesn't necessarily relate to the game.
Exactly. And it's like you were talking about your bag of Roman books, books about Roman times. It's like, well, if you were writing a scenario, that'd be great. People have written scenarios based in Roman times, but those books don't need to have any gaming content in them to be interesting to people who want to run Roman games, right? So,
yeah.
I guess the focus is that we're always kind of picking things that would lend themselves well to kind of some aspect of Call of Cthulhu gaming. Certainly like the Victorian spiritualism one seemed like a good example of that, and time travel and things of that ilk.
So we've mentioned conventions a couple of times. So we're contractually obliged to mention the Innsbruck Literary Festival, as we do every episode.
Here we go.
Tickets still on sale, folks. Yeah, we're at time of recording, we're about 4:30 at the moment, so there's still some time to get your tickets for that. And Paul, you've kindly agreed to come along to our gaming room there and run something.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm happy to come along. Yeah.
Obviously, convention is going to be a one-shot. So is that a very different approach in terms of writing and developing a scenario?
Yeah, convention games are definitely a thing of their own, because you've got to have a scenario that is going to run in a definite amount of time, whether that be like, often that's 4 hours, sometimes it's 3 hours, whatever the slot is. And you've got to be able to introduce it to people you've never met before, give them an intriguing, opening or something that's going to grab their attention, and carry them through on a story that is somehow going to be wrapped up in that time. So it can be, we don't want it totally railroaded, but equally it's got to have a structure or some sort of mechanism within that gives the GM the ability to drive it to a conclusion within the allocated time. So it is a different experience to the contrast would be running a game at home where you can, we'll leave it there and we'll pick up again next week,
Sure. Yeah.
And I kind of like the convention game because it really focuses your attention really hard, and you've got people you never met before perhaps, and that just brings an intensity to the experience, which I enjoy. Yeah. A little nerve-wracking at times, but enjoyable too.
A little bit of pressure's not always a bad thing, is it?
I kind of think so.
We're going to be finding out about pressure on the day, aren't we, Tim?
Oh, are we just? Yeah.
Oh, you are, yeah. Have you? So you've not organised a convention before, or have you done any events like this before?
I've organised some sort of events, and my wife, who's involved, has kind of organised something.
I've put gigs on and things like
that sort of stuff, but never this kind of thing.
Did do a day industrial rock festival a while ago. That was there was quite a bit of pressure on that, but herding cats is to a whole new level with bands, isn't it?
If you're dealing with musicians, then that's
so getting them all into sound check. That was the big one. It's like, well, you just get in there and sound check.
I'm loving that it's in Bedford. That's like literally up the road from me. So
well, it just happened that my wife had been to that venue as part of her job. She'd been to some conferences there, and we've been kicking around this idea for age. I mean, pre-lockdown, we were kicking it around. But it was always that thing of, where do you hold it? Do you try and get a hotel, or that kind of stuff? And then she said, King's House would be great. And they had the date and the price was good. So it all just sort of fell into place, really.
Right.
Yeah. It was good because I'm based down in Brighton. And the first thing I said was, not in Brighton, because there's nowhere to park. Everywhere is ridiculously expensive in the summer because it's a holiday resort.
Right.
So it was like, just not here and not London. For the same reason.
Yeah.
And then when you said Bedford, I was like, well, there's a direct train from Brighton to Bedford, and it takes like an hour and a half or two, just under 2 hours. It was like, well, that's a winner. So, and I think that's the beauty of it. It's quite easy for people to get to. So it's on a lot of commuter links.
I would have thought so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fairly central. Yeah. It's not Luton. Another thing in its favour. It seems like a good location. I don't know if either of you have been to the HP Lovecraft, no, not film festival. What's it called? Necronomicon?
Not yet. It's on my bucket list. That one.
No. Yeah. It's a bucket list.
That's a comparable kind of event to what the remit of it is, a comparable kind of remit. So it's fiction and gaming and films and everything to do with the kind of Lovecraftian mythos, but in Providence.
Yeah, that was kind of an inspiration, and we just felt there's all this good stuff happening in the States. They seem to have a lot of things going on.
Yes, there's definitely a demand for it and a following and an interest. Yeah. So, But
also the thing is with Lovecraft, I mean, there was talk though someone was going to try and organise an M.R. James event in Cambridge just recently, which is great. Love M.R. James, and I would have gone to that.
Oh, yeah.
But I feel with Lovecraft, you get literature, you get film, you get video games, you get gaming, you get potentially cosplay and music.
Yeah.
It seems to branch out, tentacle out in all these different areas.
Yeah, I feel Lovecraft has got a lot more brand recognition, if you like, than say M.R. James or Clark Ashton Smith or somebody. I mean, those people are all great, but I don't think the way the names carry the same weight of popularity or recognition, at least. Yeah. And also it kind of becomes a hub for all that stuff, doesn't it? You could have a talk about M.R. James at a Lovecraft festival.
Well, that's it. Yeah, it wouldn't be out of place, would it? Whereas the other way round, it might feel a little bit odd in some ways. Yeah. I don't know. It seems to work one way more than the other.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think it does. I think Lovecraft has become a kind of an umbrella term for a bit kind of whatever you want it to mean.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people think weird fiction, which is like the overall term of people like James and Benson and to people like Smith and Lovecraft. But people think more now Lovecraftian or Lovecraft instead of weird fiction, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I mean, the title you've taken for your podcast, in fact, it's got Innsmouth in it. But you're not exclusively about Lovecraft, are you?
No, we cover, anything we feel like covering, basically.
It's basically weird fiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whether that be books, TV, games, whatever.
Yeah, because we've covered M.R. James, haven't we? We've done a few different things.
Yeah. And chances are, if people are interested in that, then they're interested in the other bits that you're interested in.
Indeed. Yeah.
And they might not have heard of them, but they probably will be when you talk about them.
That's the thing as well. I listen to shows like yours as well, and you think, oh, that sounds like an interesting film. I'll check that out. It's a way of discovering new films, books, authors as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's like I've discovered so many films through the cast of Cthulhu.
Right.
Yeah. Because they cover some right weird and wonderful stuff. So I was just like, oh, that sounds ridiculously strange. I'm going to go and get hold of that,
Yeah, there is some weird stuff out there.
But also on the subject of conventions, I think there's one coming up in Milton Keynes at a gaming convention fairly soon.
Well, there's Concrete Cow that takes place twice a year in Milton Keynes.
Has to be Milton Keynes.
Yeah, it does, right? So Milton Keynes, famous for its concrete cows. That takes place, I think, in March and September. I'm not quite sure on the date. I think it's kind of mid-September. Yeah, it doesn't draw a massive crowd, but it's a good little convention with a bunch of interesting games. That's with the Milton Keynes Role Playing Games Club. Yeah, it's the 16th of September 2023. It's a one-day event on a Saturday in Wolverton, right next to the train station. So that's very handy.
And you also run your own online sort of conventions and gaming sessions as well?
So that's run by some people who are members of the Good Friends of Jackson Elias Discord channel. And that takes place, well, as we're recording this coming weekend, but when you're listening a few weekends ago. Again, that takes place more than once a year. And thanks to the people on Discord who organize that. And that's really popular. Like loads of games get run on there. And this time we're also doing some seminars. So the hosts of the convention have organized a seminar schedule. So there's a bunch of seminars with a bunch of different people invited to speak on. I'm speaking on a couple. Scott and Matt are speaking on some. I know Mike Mason's speaking on one or two. There's a whole bunch of, what do you call them, panelists. Yes,
that's a good idea. Yeah. Will they be available after the event for people?
I believe so. Yes, I'm not quite sure on how they're being put out. They might be on YouTube. I'm not sure, but they will be. They will be available to listen to. Maybe I can pass that on to you. Also, to say that myself and Mike Mason are putting out a new show. Well, it will now be out, called Eldritch Stories.
Oh.
And this is a collection of short stories that Mike and myself have written and read. And the idea is they're just really short. So they're like, the readings are like between 5 and 10 minutes. Because I don't think either of us at the moment have any ambition to write a novel or, a longer work, but we both like writing like little bits of fiction. And I particularly enjoyed a show called The Man in Black. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
That was on BBC Radio 4 back in the 80s.
Yeah.
And there were some creepy tales in that. There'd be like a half-hour show. And it'd be a drama, but it would be narrated by the Man in Black, would come on and do the introduction and then do the outro at the end.
Yeah.
And I just always loved that mode of telling the story. So we've kind of adopted that or taken influence from that sort of structure. And the first story should be out now. So if you're interested, then come on over to eldritchstories.com.
Excellent. Look forward to listening to that. And have you got any scenario or role-playing projects you're working on at the moment, or anything coming out soon?
I've said this a number of times, but I've got other projects that keep delaying it. But I've got the one I mentioned earlier, Gatsby and the Great Race, which was the first thing I had published. I'm working on a revision of that. And beyond that, I've got some work that I'm working on for Chaosium. So there's a new book called Mansions of Madness Volume 2. Mansions of Madness Volume 1 came out a few years ago. That's a collection of scenarios for Call of Cthulhu. So Volume 2 is obviously a follow-up to that. And I'm working on editing and developing the scenarios for that. And beyond that, just got Rivers of London, the role-playing game, has launched. So that's out in the world now.
Oh yeah,
which is was a departure for me from Call of Cthulhu. Something substantially different in the worlds of Ben Aronovich. I guess that's kind of it for now. Yeah. But there will be more, there's always, I've got to write another scenario for we've got a fanzine called The Blasphemous Tome that we put out in conjunction with the podcast. That comes out twice a year. So we have a summer edition and a winter edition. And each of us writes a scenario. Yeah, we alternate writing a scenario for that between the three of us. I've got to have one in the Christmas edition. So, I'm going to have to get to work on that. I have no idea what it's going to be yet. Well, I have some idea. I've got like a silly title and a silly concept. But beyond that, I don't really know.
That's all you need half the time, isn't it? It's all I need. Anyway, give me something ridiculous and I can write something about it.
You don't know where it's going to go, but
that's the fun of it sometimes.
Absolutely.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Are you surprised when you're writing where it goes?
Oh yeah, sometimes
characters do things you don't expect them to do. Sometimes,
definitely.
Quite odd the way that works. It's that's why I'm always so interested in the creative process of whatever it is where that stuff comes from. And how it develops. And even to relate that to Lovecraft, that whole dream thing. You'd have a weird dream. You'd wake up. You'd write it down. And bang, there's the shadow out of time or something, What's going on there?
Yeah.
That fascinates me.
Yeah, it's kind of I don't know, it's not really a self-help thing, but I guess it can be. But it's you want to, is it a gateway into your inner workings, really? What are you revealing in what you write about yourself as well?
I have slowly but surely been working through my shit list of all the people, all the people who've upset me over the years.
All right,
killing them off in story form. Right. He's gonna get eaten by a shoggoth.
That definitely sounds therapeutic.
Yeah.
Yes.
Catharsis. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Let it out, Tim. Let it out.
Do you just change the names very subtly?
Oh yeah.
I have done that once or twice myself. I must admit.
A friend of mine, he's the head honcho of Red Cape Publishing, Mr. Peter Blakey Novis. I recently did a film festival with him. We were down there flogging books, and he had a T-shirt. It said, "I'm an author, so be nice, or I'll put you in my next book."
Yes.
Or scenario, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, it's certainly taken inspiration from things in real life to put into scenarios. I'm not sure I've killed off anybody I know.
You should try it. It's fun.
It's going to be in there now, clearly.
You've not done the Shadow over Milton Keynes yet or anything like that.
Well, that's a great title already.
It's a great title.
Yeah.
I was always convinced that the pattern of those roundabouts, there was some sort of occult sigil going on or something.
Well, you got Midsummer Boulevard the way you get into the train station is you drive along a road called Elder Gate.
There you go.
Once you get into the train station, you can't get out again. That's the problem I've always had. I've been stuck in Milton Keynes station more than any other station in the British Isles.
Have you? What, just because the train's not running, or you just driving
trains
around?
Breaking down.
Ah, okay.
One time, last train back from London up to when I was living in Birmingham at the time, he got to Milton Keynes and stopped, and the train guard said, "Well, it's staying here, everybody off." And it was the last train, so I had to sleep on the platform. And it's just, for some reason, it's like the Bermuda Triangle for commuters, Milton Keynes.
Well, I can't be held responsible for this.
Oh, no. Well, I'm thinking that it all ties into the configuration of roundabouts. Maybe it is the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I just thought of a new mashup there, Tim, for another anthology, sort of Ballard and Lovecraft.
Oh,
that could be an interesting thing.
Yeah, my novel's a little bit like that, but post-apocalyptic Ballard meets Lovecraft. Yeah.
Definitely plenty of scope for bleakness there.
High rise, yeah. I live in a high rise, so yeah, that's terrifying. Yeah.
Do you? Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thanks a lot for coming in, Paul. It's been really great chatting to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and thanks for all the work you've done as well on the scenarios and the 7th edition and Masks of Nyarlathotep as well. I think you had a hand in the
Yeah, we had a hand in revising, working on the revised edition. Yeah.
Now, we do ask guests to perform one task before they go. Well, I say before we go, really, because, of course, as a guest, you have to stay here for the night. But I get the feeling as you'll be well prepared. I was thinking, actually, about Alexandra Beaumont, the author who came in as a guest. She came in armed. She had a spear.
Wow.
I thought if Paul gets in any trouble, he can just write himself out of it, can't he? He can just,
Oh, that sounds a bit William Burroughs now. I'm going to write myself out of the reality. Yeah.
Just a sort of portal in the wall to escape through or something. But the more observant among you may have noticed something trailing Tim up the stairs. Now, normally Tim carries it, but it seemed to be walking on its own this time. Tim, what happened?
Yeah, it seems to have developed its own method of locomotion, which is terrifying. But just stand back, let me heft it onto the bed. Here we go. Oh, look at that. Bulbous as ever.
It's time for Dagon's sack. So, Paul, as our esteemed guest, would you like to have a delve in Dagon's sack and pull out a letter for us?
Oh, I would. It's a bit moist.
A bit humid, isn't it?
Yeah, it does get a bit soggy in there. So, we have a question from Elizabeth in Montreal. And Elizabeth asks, we know that people like Wandre and Long lived quite long lives. Had Lovecraft lived longer, what do you think he would have written, and how would he have developed as a writer?
That's a good question. That's really interesting to think about. I mean, I think I'd be more interested to know, because obviously if he'd have lived like 30 or more years or something like that, you'd have got the next wave. You'd have got people like Ramsey Campbell and Ted Klein and all these kind of guys, Carl Edward Wagner, and all these kind of guys. And you know how, like, within the circle, they would all use bits and pieces of others' mythos. I'd love to have seen, like, Lovecraft do a Glarkey story or something like that. That would be really interesting because, you know, it was like Sarthogia, Clark Ashton Smith. Its first appearance was in a Lovecraft story because of the whims of publishing. But that's really interesting to think about, the collaborations.
I'm fascinated by this idea because I'm a big fan of Tolkien, and Tolkien was born 2 years after Lovecraft. So I kind of have this idea in my head. What if Tolkien had died when Lovecraft died, and Lovecraft had gone on to live till the early 70s like Tolkien did? Yeah. Because then we'd be looking at Tolkien and saying, well, there's this author that wrote The Hobbit, a kid's book. The Silmarillion wouldn't have been published. He hadn't written The Lord of the Rings then. There's no chance the Silmarillion would have been published on the back of The Hobbit. So all of that stuff that Tolkien is known for, it'd just be The Hobbit. Would he be remembered? Probably, because that would be a notable book, but there was nothing more to it than that. But think about what Tolkien went on to accomplish. And, you know, the things that have been published posthumously, the Silmarillion for one, but and parallel that with Lovecraft, and we look at what he achieved in his lifetime up till 37. But who knows what he would have then? What would his Lord of the Rings have been?
Yeah,
he might have had some other great work in him that, you know, when we look at Tolkien, we just say, oh, perhaps he'd have written another kid's book.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
You know, so. Maybe we'd be saying now, wouldn't it be interesting if Tolkien had lived on? Because everybody knows those great films that Peter Jackson made about, you know, Lovecraft's massive 3-volume work. But if Lovecraft had written, you know, something, you know, another big work and had loads of films made of it and stuff like that, and also he would have been alive if he'd lived into the 70s. He'd have been alive. He'd have overlapped with my lifetime.
That would have been something, wouldn't it?
Not that I would have met him, right? But just people who are alive in your lifetime, I think, have a different feel to people who died decades before you were born.
Yeah,
it would give a very different perspective. So I feel like it's like those rock stars, that died in the early 70s. It's like they're kind of ancient legends. And Lovecraft has kind of taken on a bit of that. I mean, maybe the fact that Lovecraft died young or relatively young adds to his legacy. I don't know.
It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you see, we were talking about Donald Wandre last time, and post-war, he didn't really write anything.
Right.
But his early stories were pretty good. I think Long, to some extent, the same. I suppose people like Robert Bloch's a little bit different. Oh, he was very young, wasn't he, when he was talking to Lovecraft?
He was almost like the first of the second wave, really.
Yeah, and Ramsey Campbell would have been similar age, But I find that fascinating idea. And if an artist's work is stopped at a certain point, do they get just forgotten or disregarded? Or say it's that bloke who wrote The Hobbit. It'd be like C.S. Lewis or something with Narnia, perhaps, It'd be on that kind of level.
Yeah, if you look at Narnia, there's a whole collection of books that go with that. There's kind of a whole world that he created.
That's true. It's a whole series, isn't it? Yeah.
And I kind of, not to bang on about it, but the whole thing with Tolkien was he had written loads of other stuff, but it was all in note form and it wasn't books. It was, it created a whole mythology, but it was far from being a published state at that time. Lovecraft had written all those short stories and letters and fragments and stuff, and you just wonder, what he might have done with that later. So that fascinates me.
The commonplace book. Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting to see if he could have broken out from the pulps as well, because I think even now there's a certain stigma is not the word really, but in real literary circles that the pulps are probably looked down on. I mean, Lovecraft has broken out of that to some extent now, maybe more in places like France than here.
It seems so, doesn't it? Yeah, there was that really good book against art against life.
Yeah, art against life. Yeah.
A great book, which took it, serious kind of literary criticism, didn't it? And I guess that's what you say about the pulps. It's kind of genre fiction in general, isn't it? It's like science fiction, fantasy, any of that stuff is kind of poo-pooed.
So I feel if he could have had a novel out at some point, that might have broken him out beyond that. And it'd be fascinating to see, because I mean, even sort of Charles Dexter Ward is a novella, really, isn't it? At the Mountains of Madness, I guess, sort of,
So it's sort of on the cusp.
Yeah.
Dexter Ward's his longest piece of work, but and it is technically a short novel or a long novella. It's one of those grey areas that I argue with editors about.
But yes, a very interesting subject. Perhaps that's something we'll return to at time. Maybe there'll be a good panel discussion on that. We could do. Thanks for that, Elizabeth. That's food for thought there. So the bus has pulled up outside. It's time for us to depart and leave Paul to whatever fate awaits him. Roll the dice, see what happens.
I'll see you in the morning. It'll all be fine.
Yeah. Don't fail your SAN roll.
Well, you want to survive to the morning, so you get that nice whelk breakfast.
Oh yes,
Yeah,
tasty.
And then relax in the Fat Face bar.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, man.
So there we are, folks. We're off again as darkness falls over Innsmouth. Thanks again to everyone who's supporting the show at the moment. We're picking up some new subscribers on the YouTube channel. And thanks, of course, to all our patrons. If you'd like to join their swelling ranks, then do check out our Patreon page, where you can sign up at 3 levels of membership. You get a quarterly copy of Innsmouth News, and you get bonus content for the Innsmouth Book Club and for Strange Shadows as well. And if you are a patron, you also get to choose which story we cover for our next episode. So check out the Patreon site, and there will be a poll there going up with 3 or 4 titles for you to choose from. So thanks again to Paul. Thanks to everyone for listening. And with that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Poynton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Bendies.